We are ready to start. Sim Pidar Halachos. The Mechaber says, "Teloim hanimtzod mikemach." Bugs that you find in flour.
This was dalat? Just one time?
2 times. We did 2 times. Yeah,
Last week.
and the week before. Anyhow, we're in Halachos. Teloim hanimtzod mikemach. Bugs that you find in flour. The most going to tell us what uchiyotzbay means. There are surim. You also to eat those bugs. Shema pirshu v'shotel aretz v'chosru. Maybe the bugs left the flour and they went on the ground and they came back into the flour. Okay, and the Ramah says v'hu adin b'melach or shar dvarim she'ein mashke. The same thing is true of salt and other things which are not liquids. And that was, I think, what the Mechaber meant when you said uchiyotzbay. And we'll see soon what that means. What's the point here? The melech and other things. Okay, we'll see what the Ramah is trying to say. We're not going to finish the halacha. There's a few more words in the halacha. That'll be for next time.
Now, why there wasn't the kemach mutter? If there were always been in the kemach would be mutter, right? If you go in the melech, when the kemach would be mutter.
Yes.
Was it like pears?
Yeah, sure. Things that are, everything is mutter. Bugs are not usher until they crawl on the ground. Or they do things that we saw in the list halacha, what they have to do to make themselves usher. So they're mutter. So they're mutter until they did what it takes to make them usher. Otherwise they'd say mutter. Okay? So before we get really into halacha, I'm just going to do a side thing, which is, nowadays we're very sophisticated about how we process flour. Okay? They centrifuge it, and they sift it, and they fumigate it, all kinds of fancy things. Afal Pikein, we still find insects in flowers nowadays, in flour anyhow. Especially if you don't keep it in the right conditions, if it's moist, or if it's kept for a long time, or if it's warm, v'chahina. But these shilas about bugs and flour were really, really negaya in the past, before we got so sophisticated. There's loads of truths about it, about people who talk about these shilas, because it was this din was a very practical din. People had bugs in their flour all the time. Okay, the bugs, the shach on our din says that we're talking about a kind of bugs that he calls Milbin. I'm just going to talk to you about Milbin for a second. And they're very small. And because they were so small, they couldn't be filtered out. Okay, they couldn't sift them out. The seeds that they had didn't filter out these very small bugs, because the shach says, or else it will be very easy. You just filter the flour. What's the shilah about? What are all these shilas? Lots and lots of shilas people talk about. Bugs in flour. What's the shilas? Just sift the flour. So he says that wasn't realistic. The bugs were too small.
The shilah didn't have to sift it, or just
But so what's the shilah? The shilah is because they weren't able physically. It just didn't work. Okay.
Shilah didn't have to sift it.
If you can sift it, then you can. Okay. And nowadays there is a way to sift it. Nowadays you could sift it. What they call the Bnei Brak sifters, okay, which is the official measurement is between 60 and 70 mesh. Okay, that's a measurement for how fine of a sifter it is, which they find to be just the right size to get at the bugs, but not too fine that doesn't let the flour go through. Okay, so that's what you want to do, and there are people who do it, especially in Eretz Yisrael, where it's more of a problem, who sift their flour to make sure there's no bugs. Okay, so what is the word? This word, I'm going to talk for a second about what this word Milbin means. Okay, the person can talk about it all the time. Ravaya says that in modern Hebrew, the word for so I'm trying to figure out the word. What are Milbin? Okay, so he says the modern word for it is, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, akaris. Okay, which is, and the English translation of that is acarine. Okay, you see where the word is coming from. Okay, which is, and the German for that word, the German for acarines are zekim und Milbin. Okay, to get where the word Milbin came from. Okay, which in English, now get back to English, is ticks and mites. Okay, so Milbin means ticks and mites, or at least that's the technical, the official word, not the word that what the class of insects are called by a scientist. But okay, now it turns out that there are 50,000 known varieties of acarines, and they suspect that there are really 1 million varieties of them. Okay, and there's a whole class of scientists who study them, and they're called
acarologists.
Acarologists. Okay, and the acarines and the acarines.
I just call them arachnids.
Okay, it must be from the same family. And the acarines range in size from 0.08 millimeters up till 20 millimeters. Okay, and
0.08 millimeters.
Very, very tiny.
Almost 1/10 of a millimeter.
100, right? 800ths of a millimeter.
800ths of a millimeter.
800ths of a millimeter, right?
Yeah,
so first of all, it just tells me 2 things. First of all, is when the poskim use the word milbin, Okay, they weren't necessarily talking about one specific thing. Okay, it wasn't like there's 50,000 of them that the scientists know about. Okay, and you have a feeling that they may not have been talking even anything. Milbin may just be a word for very small bugs. Okay,
0.08.
That's what they said.
That's a length and width.
I didn't take his yichus.
Which
But
you can't tell what it is, right?
I don't remember.
No, you know.
This is 8 microns?
I don't know. So can't think. Okay. We argued about this before. And
Ever see a dust mite?
and the second thing is,
Not that size.
and the second thing is, so first of all is that it can sign that the poskim, when they said the word Milbin, words being so scientific, it didn't mean something specific. It was just a word, general word for small bugs. Okay? I'm not sure if we could be so medaic in that word. And the second thing is, we can't figure out from the fact that Milbin or usher how tiny of a bug is usher. Okay, because they range from 0.08 millimeters all the way up to 20 millimeters. Okay, so we're not going to be able to judge from the size of a Milbin, because there are 50,000 types of them that we know about so far, how big a small bug is. Okay, that's just thinking. Okay, now, back to the halacha for real. Okay, our din, there's two shilas that we have to talk about from this part of the din, and I'm going to speak to them at the beginning just because the two questions are of course interrelated, but they're very easy to confuse one with the other. So I'm going to just speak them out just to clarify what the questions are before we give the answers to them, just to help organize. Okay, the first question is, when you take wheat off the ground, or out of the ground, and you cut it off the ground, there's no bugs in the wheat. Okay, the wheat, in almost every case, there's nothing in it. After you even if you store it as wheat, it usually doesn't become buggy. If after you grind it into flour, that's when these bugs develop. Okay, so the first question is, the bug. The first question is, the bug came in when the grain was off the ground. Okay, so the first question is, how is it possible for the bug it was made into flour and put into a bag, and the bug became a bug inside the bag? So how could the bug be usher? How is it physically possible for the bug to have been sheretz al aretz when the bug came in off the ground inside of the bag and it's still in the bag? How could it have been? So the first question is, how is it possible that it could have been sheretz al aretz? Okay, it's not usher until it's sheretz al aretz. So the first question is, how is it physically possible? The second question is, let's say it could have been. Okay, but we've seen in the previous halachos 2 examples of cases where it's possible that a bug could be sheretz, but we weren't choishish. One was by bugs in water. The Torah said over there that if you have a pail of water with a bug inside of it, you don't have to be choishish that the bug crawled out and crawled back in. That was one case. And the second was, in the previous halacha, we had a machlokes, Mechaber and Rambam, but the Mechaber said that if you have a fruit that has a hole out to the edge of the fruit, okay, there's a chayre knock of the chutz, there's a hole going out to the edge of the fruit, and there was, it giving the indication that the bug actually crawled out, because you see there's a hole going out, you have reason to think it went out and came right back in. Avopikein, the Mechaber holds we're not choishish. The Rambam holds we are, but the Mechaber holds we're not. So we have 2 examples that when you have reasons to think that the bug crawled out, you're not choishish. So the first question was, how is it possible that he crawled out? And the second is, let's say there's a way. We'll figure out how it's physically possible he could have crawled out and back in. But why should we be choishish? We see before that we're not choishish. Why all of a sudden over here, this is the first time we're being choishish that it crawled out? Why are we choishish? We should say, if it could have, but it seems to be where it started from, we shouldn't be choishish.
The bug is only mutter if it was born in the fruit.
Correct.
One side, but it never left the fruit. And even if it goes onto the outside, it's already a shot.
That's a shot, that's correct. That's a something about it.
So flour is not in the fruit anymore.
Okay.
So it's ground into little pieces.
You're trying to give me the answer. We're going to get to the answer in a second. Okay. So that's along the lines of one of the answers. Yes. But I'm not trying to ask the question. I'm trying to just show you the question, just so you can understand the questions are not the same. Okay. They're related to each other, but it's not the same question. Okay. Okay. So the first question. Now we'll do the questions one at a time. The first question was, how is it possible? How could the bug how could he have possibly left the flour if he was born inside the bag and there's no place to go? Okay, how could he?
Why was born inside the bag?
Because can you go for a job? It's like, no, you go. No. Why is born inside the bag? Because there's no bugs in the wheat.
How do you know that?
How do you know? Just experience. There's no bugs in there. And then you grind up the wheat, you turn it into flour, and put it into a bag. And now, if you
didn't see the bugs in the flour, when you first put the flour into the bag, let's say they're too small to see. So let's say they can find it's not wheat.
If they're too small to see, I mean, they weren't bugs. They don't count.
Saying they weren't bugs.
They weren't bugs that were us. Call what you wanted. They weren't bugs that were us. They were eggs. Right. Okay. So I mean,
They went out and came back in.
and that's the Mechaber saying that because that's the truth, which is bugs develop in flour. They don't develop when they're attached
I
together.
think whatever the time, but the Shulchan there was on the house.
Okay, so the first thing is, the question was, how is it possible they could have crawled out? So the truth is, I have to tell you, is that the Pri Chodesh argues on the Mechaber. Pri Chodesh says, it's not possible. It's not possible for the bugs to have gotten out. Pri Chodesh holds, there's no issue to eat bugs that are in flour. Now, you may run into problems when you start using the flour. When you start taking the flour into
The
upgrade.
Ramah was machmir before.
Yeah. No, you're on the second question, which is why should we be choishes? I'm talking not why should we be choishes. I'm saying, how was it possible that it got out? I'm on the first question. How could it possibly have gotten out? So Pri said, you're right, it's not possible. It's not possible that it could have gotten out. You could eat it, don't worry about it. Now the Pri may run into problems once he opens the bag and starts moving the flour around. Then you may have problems. But assuming the bug as it is the Pri can be made. Now, you should know, the Pri says, don't be Sanochanim B'chlal. But you should just know that the Noid Behuda, the Pischei Teshuva brings, or Noid Behuda, that says that in certain cases he would say not to be moich against people who are samach on the Pri Chodesh. Okay, so that's one thing. So just our question was, how is it possible? And you should know that the Pri Chodesh argues on the Mechaber. He says it's not true, it's not possible, and you don't have to be choishish for this thing. Okay, this is not a Gemara. This is Rishonim who said this. Pri Chodesh says it's not true. You don't have to be choishish. That's one thing. But the Beis Yosef answered the question. That was the Pri Chodesh who argues. The Beis Yosef, the Shach brings it. That the reason why it's answered is because the reason is there's a difference. The reason why there's a problem by flour is because there's a difference between bugs on the ground and bugs in the water. Okay, we saw that the Gemara has a drasha that if you have bugs in water, the Gemara made a drasha that the ribosayu, the habitat of the bug, is not just the water, but even the container that holds the water also. So if a bug crawls out of the water onto the inside, on the inside edges of the container, the bug is still mutter. It hasn't left its habitat yet. The Gemara learned that from a drasha. That was not the pasha. That was learned from a drasha. That drasha, the Beis Yosef says, doesn't apply. That drasha does not apply by bugs that are from the ground. It's only by bugs that are in the water. I think the drasha is from Mikol Asher B'mayim. Kol Hasheret Hasheret Alama. I forgot. There's a kol word over there that tells us that the inside of the container is usher, but in land-based bugs, that's not true. Okay, and therefore, wait 1 second. Therefore, by a bug that's in a bag of flour, if the bug crawls onto the bag, onto the inside of the bag, the bug has left ribosayu. The flour is its habitat. But if it crawls out of the flour onto the inside of the bag, then it would be usher. Again, a bug in water that would crawl onto the inside of the walls of the container, the Gemara says that that's considered still in its ribosayu. It's still in its original habitat. If a flour, again, enough in a second. If the bug on flour crawls out of the flour onto the inside of the bag, that bug has left its place and it's usher. Okay, so the first question, which is, and we're going to say what Yossi said in a second. Just hold that for a second. But in the flour, the way it's possible that the bug could have crawled onto the ground is that the bug crawled out of the flour, from the flour onto the edges of the big, on the inside edges of the big. And the Shach says, what the Mechaber says, Shema Pirshu V'Shartz Al Aretz is Lav Dafka. It's not Medurik. He doesn't mean Shartz Al Aretz. He doesn't mean they crawled onto the ground. He means they crawled onto something that in din has a din of ground because it's left the ribosayu. It's not the original habitat. Okay? So the simple understanding the Beis Yosef to be saying is, it's a Xeris HaKosov. It's a special kula by Mayim that the inside of the container is considered the ribosayu, and by land bugs it doesn't apply. You would simply read that as just being a Xeris HaKosov. That's how you would say it, just a Xeris HaKosov. The Gemara makes a special drasha to be matzah. Okay? But the Chazon Ish says it's not true. The Chazon Ish gives a svara to explain why it is like that. What's the difference that by those bugs it has this din and these bugs it has that din? And he says that he's explaining the drasha. I mean, it's a Xeris HaKosov, but he's explaining it like this. He says, when we say that the container of a water bug is considered the ribosayu, he says the pshat of that is that if there wouldn't be a container, there wouldn't be any place for the bugs to live. Because the water would spill all over the place. If the bug needs 6 ounces of water to live in, if you didn't have a container, the water wouldn't be 6 ounces together for the bug to live in. So the reason why the Torah tells us that the inside of the container is considered the habitat where the bug lives is because that contributes to where the bug is going to live. The bug is not just in the water. The bug in the water, which is in a container. As opposed to, if the bug is in an apple. The fact that the apple happens to be in the bag has nothing to do with the growth of the bug. The bug does not help or nothing comes to the bug because it's sitting in a bag. The bag is a convenience that you put your apple into a bag. But in the water, the bag is what makes a difference. The container is what makes a difference. And therefore, bugs that are in water, that are in a container, then the container is considered rebus. A bunch of apples that are sitting in a bucket, that bucket has nothing to do with them, and that's not considered the habitat of the bug, the fact that it's on the container. If it leaves the fruit, goes onto the container, it's also. Now, so the Chazon Ish says, now that I told you that that's a svara, he says, there's now two different types of land bugs. He says, if the land bug is in a fruit, like I said to you, in an apple, if you have a bug in an apple, everybody agrees that the container counts as nothing. Because the container does absolutely zilch for the growth of the bug. What's the machlokes? I mean, machlokes, the shach and the pri chodesh, or the Beis Yosef has 2 days. What's the machlokes about that this din about flour is because flour, or like Ramah says, salt, are an in-between between a liquid and a solid. Because the flour, if it didn't have a container, it would sort of hold its own. It would sort of be still a mass of flour, but it wouldn't be held together in the same way that it would be like a fruit is. If the apple was out of the bag, the apple would still be a whole apple. But as far as the bug is concerned, he doesn't care that he's in a bag. But the flour is like partially being held by the bag and partially not. And therefore there's machlokes. And the Machaber who's saying that the bugs in the flour are usher is because he's learning that the bag is not considered the ribusayu. The bag, even though it's flour, or the Ramah says, or salt, or chayotz, like other powders, even though it's a powder, the bag is not considered ribusayu. So it's just like it's in a fruit. Wait a second, it's like it's in a fruit, and the mela crawling onto the inside of the bag is the way the bug crawled out of its habitat. Yes, sir. You want to say this? Oh, they're going to say this. Okay. So that's what the Chazon Ish said. Once I explained to you the svara between the Gzeres and Kosev, he says, so now, there's now 3 levels. He says, there's water bugs where the container for sure does count. There's bugs in, let's say, fruit, or in a vegetable, that the container surely does not count. And the shaila, which our Machaber is being machmer, that is what to do with powders and flour and salt and other powders like that. Okay? So there's just two things to end off with on that part is, first of all is, the Chazon Ish tells you himself that if you look in the Beis Yosef, you'll see one of the ikar mukaris that the Beis Yosef brings in talking about the Shaila is Hagoy Shari Dura. Okay, and if you read the Hagoy Shari Dura, the Chazon Ish tells you this. I'm not telling you. He says you'll see that he didn't learn like it. The Hagoy Shari Dura brings rayas from fruit to the cases of powders. Okay, so the Chazon Ish is telling us this whole chiluk that powder, that the Shaila here is about powders and not about fruit. And if you look in that Hagoy Shari Dura, he says you'll see that he doesn't really. He says he's matmiya. Why he learns like why he says like that? Because according to the Chazon Ish, the way he understands it, says it doesn't make sense. Okay, so it's sort of a kasha. Okay, and the secondly is that we now understand what the Ramah meant. I already said this sort of. We understand what the Ramah meant when he said, and the same thing by salt, and what the Machaber meant when he says kamav uchayotzebay. Okay, what was the point of that uchayotzebay? Okay, he was adding in was that this din is a special din about flour and salt and other powders. Uchayotzebay meant like that because it was in fruits. The last halacha daled was about fruits. And halacha hey is about powders. Okay, so halacha hey is uchayotzebay means to be other powdery kind of substances.
Fruit would be also.
Right, so fruit was, of course, it's also. In fruit, we even had, if it went up to the outside of the fruit, we had all those kind of shilos like that. You know what I mean? That would be, of course. Now, halacha hey is telling you, in flour, it's also also. In powders, it's also also. It's like as if this is the chiddush of this thing, that's what this thing is about powders, the last thing was about fruits. So
it doesn't have to be chiddush.
No, it doesn't have to be. No, but he means to say, he's being machadash that those kind of cases. Okay? I have to remind you, if it'll help you, make you feel better, is that the Beis Yosef says, and the Machaber says in the Hakdama that this is supposed to be a kitzur of the Beis Yosef. You weren't supposed to learn Shulchan Aruch. You were supposed to be at the end of the shir after you learned the whole Torah Beis Yosef. Now you're supposed to this for the Chazara. You're supposed to learn this afterwards. You know, so this is not supposed to. You're not supposed to have a sefer of Shulchan Aruch. You're supposed to have a tour, and on the bottom, So if you just would have learned that whole Beis Yosef, then you'd say, it's Holaim, and I'm sorry, became a Chayetz by Asurim because maybe they were Pirshu. That'll make you feel better. Okay. Anyway, okay. So now we've dealt with our first question. Okay, well, we basically dealt with our first question, which is, how is it possible that they left the fruit? They could have left because they climbed out of the flour onto the inside of the bag. Okay, that's how it's possible they could have done it. Now we have our second question. Why should we be chayshish? If you have a 5-pound bag of flour, why should I be chayshish that the bug crawled to that spot when I don't have to be chayshish otherwise? So one half of that question is obviously not a question. Okay? One half of that question was, why is it different than water? Okay? It's obviously different than water. That seems simple. We're not going to have to deal with it. It's different than water because the rules are different. In water, if it crawls onto the container, it's mutter. Over here, if it crawls onto the container, it's usher. So the water was not such a kasha. But the other question is, why, and this was many to talk about, is why the Mechaber holds that if it's chayre nakav l'chutz, I mean, there's reason to think it crawled out, you don't have to be chayshish. So why, by our case, do you have to be chayshish? Why isn't it like chayre nakav l'chutz? We shouldn't have to be chayshish. Okay. So, just like with the last time, the Bach argues on the Mechaber. The Bach says, in two different places, here and in Chuvas, the Bach says that you have no reason to be chayshish that they called out. It's not different, no different than chayre nakav l'chutz. Maybe it's even better than that case. You don't have to be chayshish. Okay, and the Taz sort of agrees with that, and there's a Taz a little later on that he maybe sort of agrees, or maybe it's enough to be mitzaref it for sekas, the tzad that maybe didn't crawl out onto the outside. Okay, but this sort of three explanations as to why over here the Mechaber is being machmer. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about, these explanations. Okay, the first is, and this is what Yossi said way back when, is like this. The Chacham Zalman says that there's a simple reason why we're chayshish in our case different than in the cases before. He says because when we had before let's say a bug in an apple. Okay, well the bug's in the apple. The bug has no reason to leave the apple. He says, but in flour, he says every grain of flour is a different fruit. It's as if each grain of flour is its own place. So it's like sort of automatic that the bug left it. If the bug ever went any place, he crawled off of his grain of flour. In that bag of flour, there's 80 zillion grains of flour inside there. So each grain is tiny. So the reason why we're chayshish by flour and salt and other powders is because it's so easy and so mysterious that the bug crawled out of it. When you have a fruit, there's the whole apple here with a hole in it, why should the bug have left it? We have no reason to think that. It's in here. But in flour, it not only is it possible, it's actually very likely that it crawled off this grain of flour because come on, how big is the grain of flour?
I don't know. So you don't have to go into the bag.
Right. So his answer.
So he's not saying like the
right. So he's not saying like the Beis Yosef. He would.
Yeah, right. It's fine.
No. So as I'm going to get to in a second, Hal Gufa, so the Aruch Shulchan, he says, hold on a second. How come Beis Yosef didn't say that? The Beis Yosef is banging his head against the wall, saying, how can that possibly left the thing? The Beis Yosef says, it crawled on the inside of the bag, and bags are different. He says, I don't understand. Why didn't the Beis Yosef say what you said? Isn't it obvious that flour is a million little grains? So, whole goof of the Aruch Shulchan says, it can't be what you're saying. That's one of the Aruch Shulchan's arguments is, what are we talking about insides of bags? In other words, it would have answered the other question so easily, it would have been such a simple answer to the first question, that we wouldn't, that it's like so obvious, that it must not be true. Okay, it must not be like that. Okay? So then the Aruch Shulchan explains. He explains what's pshat. So why taka don't we look at it as each grain being another fruit? Why don't we say that? What's wrong with the Chacham saying that? Why isn't it that every grain is another fruit? Like we would say, if it was a bunch of grapes, if it was a bunch of raisins that went from one raisin to the next, we would say that.
We consider kamach balach, right?
Yes, it is.
So you see, we look at it one
as one mass. You say, we look at it and say, okay, I don't think he doesn't say it that way. He says a drop different. Listen to what he says. He says like this. He says, when you have a bug that's born inside of a raisin, okay, the ribosai, the habitat for that bug is the inside of that raisin. To the point that we even have a shaila and a halacha we had is, what happens if it went onto the outside of that raisin? Is it usher? Okay, because the habitat is the inside of the raisin. He says, but if a bug is born on the outside of a fruit, then the fruit is not its habitat; it's on the outside of the fruit. Then the container of fruit is its habitat. Then in other words, if it's born on a piece of flour, if it was born in the piece of flour, I mean, let's say it had been born in a bean, we're going to have that in halacha above. It was born inside of a bean. Okay, then the bean is its habitat. But if it's born in a bag of beans, then the bag of beans, that whole mass of beans is its habitat. So the ribosayu, since it was born on the outside of the flour, so to speak, on the outside of each curve of each speck of flour, that means it's not this piece of flour is not its habitat. It's on the outside. So then look at the bigger picture. It's like in water. We don't say the drop of water the bug was born on is its habitat. We say all the water because it wasn't born in the drop, it was born, so to speak, out of the drop, in this bigger mass of water. So it's not only because of what David said, because it's lach balach. Even if it would have been bigger fruits, if it would have been born on...
He said, if a bug is born outside... If a bug is born outside of a raisin, is it mutter or also? It's born on the surface of a raisin.
Mutter.
It's mutter?
Until... Now, he's saying is, if you have... The other Acharonim say like this also, if you had a bag of those raisins, if it went from raisin to raisin...
How big? It's on the ground.
I don't know, a pile of raisins. Call it a pile of raisins. Okay. It would still be mutter. Right. So
on the outside of a raisin, it's mutter?
Right. Because it didn't leave you beside. It never crawled on the ground. What's the difference? Why are you so perplexed? Until it goes out of it...
on the table. Is it mutter or is it also?
Mutter.
Why?
Why not? Oh, well, is it mutter? I don't. A table maybe is not a place for living. I don't know if a place is supports the fruit. I'm not sure. Maybe I don't know if the table gives any.
So put the pun I can say that.
Okay. So
this is part of the thing here.
Okay. So the Aruch Shulchan says, he says once he says this to explain why he argues on the Chacham Sodom, then he says he now can answer our second question also. He says like this. He says when you have a bug that's born inside of a fruit, we have no reason to think that the bug is going to leave the fruit. He's happily in there. He has no reason to walk out of the fruit. Even a chayrunok of the chutz is the hole to the outside. We have no reason that he used that escape hatch. Over here, and here also, the bugs are in the flour. We have no reason to be chayshish that the bug would leave the flour. He has no reason to leave this 5-pound bag of flour. But that doesn't mean that the bug never brushed up against the wall of the bag. He wouldn't leave it. He wouldn't leave his fruit beside him. Just like over there, he wouldn't leave his fruit. But doesn't mean he wouldn't have walked up along the edge of the bag. That would have been still within the home is this 5-pound bag of flour. So he wouldn't leave his home. Fine. We don't have to be conscious that he crawled out of the bag and back into the bag. But he could have, within the bag, there are places that he could have made himself also, which is the wrapper. And that's why we're here with Choshish. And the Ramah. The Ramah argues on that. The Ramah says that even by Nakav L'chutz, Choshish crawled onto the outside of the fruit. Which is a little similar to the inside of the bag.
Inside the pail because...
The inside of the
inside of the pail, the water. That's different because once they get...
Because the inside of the pail is ribosai, the outside is not.
No, I'm saying if they call it...
the reason why it's different is because there's a special riboy that bugs that are on the inside of a pail are considered inside, so they aren't considered outside. There's a question. It's a clear question. Okay, now, the last teretz is two different poskim who say along the same lines. Okay, but you'll see it's the same answer basically. One is it's Tefillah Tzaddik that's over here, and the Pri Megadim, and they say it's like this: even though Chayr Nakav L'chutz gives us, the way I can say it is, practical reasons to think that the bug crawled out. I mean, it seems like he went out. And look, there's a hole there. He looks like he went out. There's reasons to be chayshish, but for halachic reasons, we don't say that. Okay, as opposed to here, we don't. What they say is like this: the Tzila Tzaddik says the reason is there's a cloud called Katan Tzakanoya. The bug is in the fruit. We assume that he never left the fruit. Even though there are practical reasons to think that he left the fruit, the Katan Tzakanoya is a halachic principle that says we don't have to be chayshish that he left there. Okay, and he said that doesn't apply to a loose pile of flour. Doesn't have such rules of Katan Tzakanoya. That's what he says. And the Pri Megadim and the Pri Megadim says that the reason is because it's true that the reason why the mechaber is mekel by Chayr Nakav L'chutz is because even if he would have crawled out, it would still be a sfek feker. That's what Pri Megadim says. Let's say he crawled out. Where would he have gone? He didn't go off the fruit. He would have gone onto the surface of the fruit. Well, on the surface of the fruit is itself a suffix in the Gemara. So suffix if he went out, suffix even if he went out, if he would have been also because he would have only crawled onto the fruit. So therefore it's a sfek feker. That's why the mechaber is mekel. And in argument, the mechaber is imachman because if he would have crawled out onto the bag, he would have been also. Excuse me. So the
bag is also.
If the bug crawled onto the inside of the bag,
presumably the inside of the bag is also.
The basis said the inside. We already got that. That's we're on the second part. We know anyway. So then the Pri Megadim says, so if he crawled on the inside of the bag, so it's just a suffix that he might have crawled into and he'd be answered. As opposed to by the fruit, if he would have crawled out, where would he have gone? He went onto the surface. How good for that would have been a suffix also. So I'm saying these two answers are similar in that both of them are saying, it's an equal chashash that he called out of the fruit as it's called out of the flour. But for a halachic reason, we don't have to be choshesh. Either we don't have to be choshesh because Kanin Kanoi tells you don't be choshesh to happen, or the Prim Gothams, maybe physically it happened, but then there was a svek and here it would have not been a svek here it would have been ushered, and that's why that's why here we're choshesh and there we're not, because there it's a svek. Okay, so there's two answers.